Good afternoon and greetings from Timor-Leste. I'm Olinda Lucas and this is my colleague Catharina Williams van Klinken. We have had an interesting time researching Tetun Dili poetry and we would like to share the results with you. We will present in our best language, I in Tetun and Catharina in English. Now, over to you.
Let's start with the question. Tetun Dili has developed from Tetun Dili, one of the vernacular Austronesian languages in Timor, and Tetun Dili has a strong poetic tradition of parallelism and veiled language. Tetun Dili also has a long history as a lingua franca, over which time it's acquired a lot of Portuguese influence and in later years Indonesian influence. Tetun Dili has only been widely written since the vote for independence in 1999. So how do these diverse influences play out in modern poetry? We found very little written on the topic. Soares 2016 and Barreto Soares 2019 both write about specific poets focusing on their ideas. In fact, very little has been invested in poetry, either by government or by researchers. The preamble in the East Timorese National Cultural Policy document states that Portuguese and Indonesian governments didn't invest in culture, nor did the post-independence national governments up to that point. Soares laments that international institutions too have focused on researching the material and social circumstances of Timor-Leste, but have mostly overlooked written forms of literature. So too Siapno in 2012 laments that dancers and musicians have been sidelined while centre stage goes to urban politicians, bureaucrats and report writers. The same could be said about the sidelining of poets. I'd just like to note that all references and quotes are in a separate PDF file, since there are too many to fit on a PowerPoint. The outline. We'll start with a background to Timor-Leste and our data sources, then have a quick look at traditional Tetun Dili poetry before moving on to Tetun Dili poetry, looking at themes, vocabulary, grammar, poetic structure and discourse features, and finishing with the question, what makes Tetun Dili poetry? Timor-Leste, the land of the rising sun, the land of the crocodile, lies between Australia and Indonesia in the eastern Indonesian archipelago and is home to 1.3 million people. It's also home to 25 or so local languages, 5 Papuan and the rest Austronesian. It has 2 official languages, Tetun and Portuguese. If we need them, we have 2 working languages, Indonesian and English. Of all these languages, Tetun Dili is the main language of public life. In the last census, 31% said they spoke it as a mother tongue, and another 57% said they spoke it as a second or third language. Timor's complex linguistic situation is a result of a complex political history. Thomas argues convincingly, in my opinion, that Tetun became a lingua franca as a result of 2 Tetun-speaking kingdoms. We have no idea how long they lasted, but they were certainly in existence 400 or 500 years ago. One of them is Wehali in the east, where I did my PhD research, and the other is Lucca in the west. The Portuguese arrived in the early 1500s, initially to trade and later to rule as colonial masters. Of course, Portuguese was the language of government, and when they started schools in about 1900, Portuguese was also the language of schools. The first writing in Tetun Dili that has been published and that we still have is a catechism published in 1885. And when Dili was became the capital in 1769, it has been recorded that Tetun and Portuguese were spoken in the capital. And that's why we now call it Tetun Dili, and at that time it was called Tetun Praça, Praça being the term for the Dili marketplace. Portuguese rule was followed by Indonesian rule for 24 years after the invasion of 1975. During that period, Indonesian was the language of government and education. Tetun Dili, however, was used by the Catholic Church in the liturgy, and later we will see that the variety of Tetun that they developed in the liturgy has been very influential in poetry. It was also used by Frettlen in the literacy campaign, in addition to the normal use as a language of intercultural communication. Following the vote for independence in 1999, there were 3 years of UN interim rule. During this period, English was important, and it still is for UN agencies and international NGOs. And with the restoration of independence in 2002, Tetun and Portuguese were the official languages. Our data sources. We have 2 sources of data. One is poems in Tetun Dili. Based on how little was being published about poetry, we rather expected East Timor to be what the Dolin Murak called a literary desert. We were surprised to eventually find so much poetry in Tetun Dili, much more in fact than prose. We did a detailed analysis of 40 poems from 26 writers with a range of styles and topics, all but one from the last 20 years. This was supplemented by reading of over 200 additional poems from a much larger number of poets. We also had the privilege of interviewing some poets, both well-known and aspiring. And we talked to some people who were involved in traditional negotiations across linguistic borders in domains in which poetry would normally be used. We'll start with a quick look at Tetun poetry. Tetun poetry is characterized by strong obligatory parallelism. Everything's said twice. There is a lot of metaphor and veiled language, allusions, and special vocabulary. There are different types of poetry. Ritual poetry is the domain of ritual specialists, but there is a lot of other poetry which is just ubiquitous. Old women used to come to me and say, "Have you heard the poem for the broom?" And I think, I can hardly speak about everyday things, but I don't know the poem for the broom. It was used in courtship, narratives, advice, marriage negotiations, welcoming guests, prayers to the ancestors. This poem is by ritual specialist Pete Tahunahak from Wehali.
Ba'ama naran la kaka, ba'ama naran la temi, iha letem ba, iha as ba, iha lolo liman la to, kniit ay la day.
Our question was, can Tetun poetry be adapted to Tetun Dili? Everyone we asked gave an emphatic answer of no. Tetun Dili cannot be used for traditional poetry. And indeed, that's not unexpected. Too much Tetun vocabulary has been lost in Tetun Dili. If we look just at the Fehan dialect, 30% of the vocabulary has been retained in Tetun Dili, 55% has been lost, and 15% has changed pronunciation or meaning. It's possible that an analysis of a dialect such as Soibada would give a slightly higher retention rate, but we don't believe the numbers will change significantly. The other important issue is that the poetic register has been completely lost, as Tetun Dili was a lingua franca for such a long period. You don't use Tetun Dili, you don't use lingua francas for poetry and for ritual purposes. So, what do people do when they're doing cross-cultural negotiations involving poetry? What do you do if your daughter wants to marry a man from another village and another language? Some of the people we asked said they would then use one of the languages, in particular the language of the woman's family, and they would have an interpreter into Tetun Dili prose. Others said we each use our own language and we have an interpreter who explains it in Tetun Dili prose. And others said we give up altogether and we just use Tetun Dili prose. Whatever the case, it's very clear that Tetun Dili poetry is not a continuation of Tetun poetry. Let's turn to Tetun Dili poetry. We'll start by looking at an example of poetry. This one is by Hugo Fernandez. He has a degree from Indonesia and masters from Wales. He's been a journalist and is currently director of the National Centre for Shega, the follow-up body to the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The title is Fini Diak, Good Seed.
La barisira hanesam fini, kari hefatu klaran, prega iha paredi, so iha dut at nilel. Loro nida finine se moris, fera te fatuk, hakua te paredi, hamate te dut at sira. Tirane hela ho story.
This is a favourite topic of poets. It looks like it's written about children, but if you look at the date, the 12th of November 2020, you will realise that it's the anniversary of the Santa Cruz massacre of the 12th of November 1991. This massacre was a turning point in the struggle for independence since it was filmed. The film was smuggled out to the world, and then the world knew that there was a serious problem in East Timor. The topic can be seen only from the date. And for middle-aged people such as Hugo Fernandez, it is perfectly acceptable to call young people who died in that massacre children. The other theme is, of course, hope, and very many poems in Timor have this combination of lamentation, commemoration, and hope. The vocabulary is almost all native Tetun. We've underlined the 4 Portuguese words. As we'll see later, for everyday conversation, having only 4 Portuguese words in a text like this would be very little. The grammar is standard Tetun Dili grammar, except that some subjects are omitted. We're not told who scattered the seeds amongst the rocks, nor are we told the background. We need local understanding to know that this is talking about a graveyard. The poetic style, as almost all poetry in Tetun Dili, is free verse. There's no rhythm, no rhyme, no playing with word order or sounds. It's written in lines as one stanza, though this one could readily be turned into 2. 1, the commemoration, and 2nd, the hope. There is a limited parallelism. Lines 2, 3, and 4 all have the same structure of a transitive verb, not specifying who did it to who, and then the location. There's some repetition of words to link the 2 parts of the poem, rock, wall, and weeds. Much of the poem is fairly literal. The young people did die amongst the rocks and weeds of the cemetery, but the poetry tells us that the nailed to the walls refers to their pictures being posted up on walls. The punctuation is minimal, as it often is in poetry, and if you notice very carefully, amongst the poems that we present today, spelling is highly variable from poet to poet. And as in a lot of poetry, the main point comes at the end. Often a message of hope, as in this case, tyranny has lost. Not surprisingly, the first modern poets in East Timor used Portuguese. Fernandes Silva actually lived in Portugal for most of his life and wrote poetry in Portuguese, often about Timor. Probably the most famous poet from that early era is Francisco Borja da Costa. He wrote quite a few revolutionary songs. Pátria, Pátria in Portuguese was put to music and became the national anthem. Forró Ramalhau in Tetun Dili was also put to music and became a popular resistance anthem. He was killed in the invasion in 1975. During the Indonesian occupation, older poets continued to use Portuguese and younger ones mainly used Indonesian, but some started up in Tetun Dili. From 1999 on, there was an increasing use of Tetun Dili. What are Tetun Dili poets like? All of them are educated in Portuguese and or Indonesian, some also in English. The vast majority are urban. Most write poetry in more than one language, also writing in Indonesian, Portuguese, English, and or their mother tongue, sometimes also French. The best known poets are tertiary educated professionals or other national level leaders who read poetry in multiple languages. Borja da Costa read Bertolt Brecht and Pablo Neruda. Abe Barreton mentions Walt Whitman and is studying Spanish to be able to read Latin American poets in the original language. Alexandra Tillman mentioned her favourite Indonesian poets, Rendra and Putu Wijaya. Johannes Manhitu mentions poets in many languages. However, not all poets are educated. Sandra Tillman says she has over 200 people who have communicated with her about their poetry. many with junior high school education. Abe Barreto, a well-known poet, also encourages younger poets through meetings. All of these poets are pioneers. Dadolin Murak has said to us they walk in the steps of Dante, who wrote the first poetry in Italian, so making poetry available to the non-elite. Where do they publish? There's no literary journal, no outlet in newspapers, no national archive. There are limited opportunities to publish, so most poetry is self-published. If they print books, then they have short print runs. And even a $10 book costs a day's salary for my academic staff. Nevertheless, we keep coming across new poems. In Facebooks, blogs, websites, sometimes in YouTube as performances. Sometimes we come across a new poem that goes against everything that we have concluded to date. Some poems also have been translated into other languages and published internationally. What makes a poet? All the poets we have interviewed or read interviews with agree that poetry is a serious business, just as it is in traditional contexts. A poet must have a message worth hearing and say it in a beautiful way that speaks to the heart as well as the mind. Ildefonso Pereira Caboran, in this poem, Like a Rock, explains,
Hao nudar poesia, nudar dadoli, hanesan knananuk, hanesan normatan, nudar aning maus, matak numalirin. Hao nudar opinião, hanesan comentário, nudar mahusuk, hanesan lia maus, nudar belundiak, nudar fatukadi, kadi oneon, hanesan tsunami, halo o hakfodak.
Abe Barreto told us that poetry has a power to inspire, motivate, captivate, and encourage people to take action. He sees it as an oasis in the desert, nourishing the thirsty. He sees it as a filter to prevent people uncritically accepting the values transmitted through globalization. Sandra Tillman told us she sees her words as a means to influence the world. And her principle, as the daughter of a guerrilla fighter, is, "My words are bullets." Antonio Mota, in his Facebook site, says his goals are to be a voice for the voiceless, to sweeten Timor's name and to promote Tetun. Hugo Fernandez added that he sees himself as contributing to the historical record. Nevertheless, after reading hundreds of poems, we did come across some light-hearted ones too, mainly by Antonio Mota. What are the themes? Many poems are written in response to a particular occasion, such as the poem by Hugo Fernandez we just read. For instance, this year, there were poems written in response to the floods in Dili at Easter time, to the threat of coronavirus, to the death of a vegetable seller by the roadside. Sometimes it's only the date on the poem that shows us what the topic is. Hugo Fernandez told us that poets are stirring each other up over social media to write about events as they happen, and that they're coordinating to publish an event-paced anthology of poems. We analysed 73 poems for theme. 13 of them were social or political criticism, often a lament over things like corruption or continued poverty. 6 were laments, 4 over massacres, 1 over a father's death, and 1 over lack of personal happiness. 17 were advice and encouragement. 12 were praise, mainly of fallen heroes of the resistance. The rest were narratives, romantic love, descriptions, meditation, prayer, a challenge to war, and quite a few that were mixed. Uncommon genres are normally handled in other ways. Narratives and descriptions are sometimes part of a larger poem, but usually expressed in prose. Prayers to the ancestors are normally handled by vernacular language poetry. Christian liturgy and prayers are normally handled by liturgical Tetun prose. Humour is often done in prose. And welcoming formal guests, such as the president, is still done in Tetun Terik. Let's have a look at the vocabulary that's used in Tetun Dili poetry. In Tetun Dili, when we're in everyday conversation, as you can see in the rightmost column, we don't mix in words from Tetun Terik. We mix in maybe 5 to 15% Portuguese, more in the city, less in rural areas. Depending on who we are and where we are, perhaps up to 5% Indonesian, and English is rare. In more formal contexts, as you see in the next column to the left, the percentage of Portuguese goes up a lot and Indonesian is omitted altogether. In writing, it can be up to 80% of nouns, verbs and adjectives are in Portuguese. The liturgy is quite different. It has 5% Tetun Terik, perhaps 10% Portuguese and absolutely no Indonesian or English. Poetry, as you can see, is more like liturgical Tetun. Some people don't mix in any Tetun Terik, but some poets use up to 6%. The percentage of Portuguese is quite low, 2 to 11. Indonesian is non-existent and English is rare. We asked some poets why they preferred Tetun over Portuguese loans. Several expressed that this was nationalism, their pride in being able to express themselves well in Tetun without having to resort to Portuguese. The need to develop Tetun. Dadolin Murak went so far as to say that it's a mortal sin if we don't do that. Some noted that Tetun actually sounds more poetic than Portuguese. And one pointed out correctly, I think, that if you use a lot of Portuguese, it sounds more like a report than like a poem. Where do they get their Tetun Terik words from? From the liturgy, from other literary texts, and from people who speak Tetun Terik. After all, 6% of the population speak it as their home language. We also looked at creativity. There are very few options for creativity in Tetun Dili as it's got very little productive morphology. But we did find some examples. There were some compounds like besisiak, ferocious metal for gun, or fan ibun, sell the mouth, which was invented as a term to mean gossip for profit. Of course, there is creativity in collocations as well, as shown by this poem by Antonio Mota in praise of his mother.
O hanano nebe hakere kiha o fuan, o estima hau iha o hitilete, hau hakmate kiha o nek hakuak, o ne hanano sasing hau ne dukur, o ne hamnasa hakmau sa fuan, o ne kosar hakerek hau ne mehi.
Laughing, making restful my heart, and sweat writing my dreams, that's new for Tetun. We wondered whether Tetun poetry would have much code switching. Partly we expect that it would, because some of the Portuguese poetry we came across used Tetun words for things which were associated with Timor. In this poem at the bottom of the screen, you see maromak, god, kuda, horse, even though Portuguese has terms for these. However, we found very little. Mostly it was direct quotes, such as in this poem by Dadolin Murak, which brings to mind the celebrations of the restoration of independence in 2002.
Patria, patria, nyemenum furak no cleanteves, terra livre, povo livre, mebe itabarak maxidau livre.
Here she quotes directly from Borja da Costa, using the original language. Let's turn to grammar. We'll see that poetry uses Tetun Dili grammar, liturgical Tetun and Tetun Terik. It's very concise and it has almost no journalistic influence. Tetun Dili word order is quite fixed. Strongly subject-verb-object, or rather subject-verb, and noun modifier. And poets don't try to change it. However, it's quite common to be less explicit in poetry than in prose. Subjects are omitted more often, thus giving veiled speech, as we noted in Hugo Fernandez's poem about the children, the young people. Another big difference is that body parts in Tetun require a possessor, but in poetry, the possessor is often omitted. The following example is from Apeo Mesquita Babo about the death of Christ.
Aitarak tu haleun orentos, prego baku borus ai no liman. Dima sona borus iha isi isfati no ran nak duir. Tuir dima no disuli bamundo.
Here it speaks of feet and hands without specifying that it's Christ's feet and hands. By the way, it also talks about breathplace, which is a creative way to replace the Portuguese word pulmão for lungs. Another aspect of grammar is that there is often some Tetun influence. Nearly all of this has come through liturgical Tetun. In particular, possessives often use just juxtaposition, ha'u inan, I mother, or regular possession with nia as a linking word, ha'u nia inan. Often the same poem will use both constructions. Relative clauses often use be instead of nebe, following Tetun that's used in the church. Both these options also work towards conciseness. And then almost all poets use nor for and instead of Portuguese e, so reducing the Portuguese load. There is a little bit of direct Tetun influence. In particular, a few poets use subject marking prefixes on verbs. Usually this is limited to the third person singular n for just a few words. Nordi bring, norsi from. So these have just been memorized as third person words. One poet uses conjugated forms just for phonological variation, as she explained to us. It sounds stronger. Here is an example. O nusik hela inan aman, you, second person, left, third person, your father and mother. As you can imagine, Tetun speakers are not always so impressed with this usage of conjugated forms. A third feature of grammar is that it avoids the new loan constructions which are very, very common in the media. Tetun Dili media uses several new constructions modelled on Indonesian and Portuguese. For example, 3 types of passives, final quote margins. These are extremely rare in poetry. The media also uses loan translations, and these too are rare in poetry. Even though many poets have been translating their own poetry from Indonesian before they started writing in Tetun, and quite a few poets are journalists or translators who are used to these constructions. As Hugo Fernandez said, we're just more careful when we're writing poetry. Let's turn to poetic structure. As we've seen, almost all poetry is free verse. All of it's written in lines. 75% of the poems we analysed use stanzas, and consistently a stanza has a theme of its own. Most poets vary the number of lines per stanza, usually 3 to 8, but Ildefonso Pereira Caboran often has poems in which each stanza has the same number of lines. He also uses more parallelism than most poets. Linkage between lines is very similar to prose. Parallelism, positive, negative, positive, tailhead. Many lines just continue the sentence from the previous line. As you would expect in poetry, there are very few conjugations, 0 to 13% of clauses starting with a conjunction, as compared to prose, where there's 21 to 47%. The following example is by Ildefonso Pereira Caboran from a poem called Povo da Menaim. He's praising the Timorese for looking like they were supporting the Indonesian push for pro-autonomy vote in 1999, and then when push came to shove, they voted as they wanted to.
Viva povo da Menaim, ema da Menaim matenek no Maduro. Matenek no Maduro bele confia demais com fu fali.
Here he's using tailhead, smart and mature, the next line starting too with smart and mature. He's also using the lack of subjects to good avail. Who can trust who? I'm assuming that it was the Indonesian authorities who were trusting the Timorese to vote for them. But they trusted too much and it all turned kung fu. This, by the way, is one of the very few examples where it seems that poets are playing with sounds, with that final line having conf and conf twice. Let's turn to poetic features. These are typical of Tetun Dili prose and of cross-linguistic poetry. Firstly, parallelism. 58% of the poems we analysed have some sort of parallelism, but they rarely use it much and without any apparent fixed structures. Prose has parallelism too sometimes, but much less. This example is from Ramos, who writes to encourage the young people that they are the dawn.
Haderona Haderona ba zer sound phone. One foho o samiam barak. One tasi ikan barak tebes. One raine rikusoim ba in tebes. Haderona
This poem is also a little bit unusual in having the opening two lines repeated as the beginning of most stanzas, and repeated at the end of this stanza as well. He also has parallelism. Your mountain, your sea, your land has gold, fish, wealth. Apart from parallelism, there's also other repetition of words. We found 35% of poems have some repetition of words, but again we found no pattern. Usually they only repeat a word in the next line or two. Sometimes they repeat an entire line, such as the previous poem. Sometimes they repeat the title somewhere in the poem. The poem we just read repeats the title, We Are the Dawn, as the last concluding line of the poem. And sometimes they repeat poems without parallelism and without repeating whole lines, such as Rocks, Weeds and Walls, repeated in Hugo Fernandez's poem Good Seeds, which tie together the beginning and the end of the poem. Of course, poetry has figurative language, but we were surprised to discover that it doesn't have a great deal. 50% of the poems we analysed had some metaphors, often based on nature. Here is a poem by Alexandra Tillman called Keep Shouting. It's addressed to the parliamentarians. We read two extracts.
O makakutak povunia. O makliman aing beat like. Hey, lian nenuluresin lima. Lian povunia. Lian mafukun. Hakilar na fatimba.
So here she is comparing the parliamentarians with the brains of the people and the arms and legs of the powerless. By the way, she's also addressing them as the 65 voices, a fairly rare example of metonymy. Siapno, in 2013, wrote that older musicians had to be adaptable depending on who was in the audience. They had to be able to sing Portuguese love songs, Indonesian songs, Tetun folk songs, or revolutionary songs. She observed that younger post-independence musicians don't have this range, as they don't have to serve different masters. It seems to us that younger poets too have a lesser range and veil their language very little. Interestingly, figurative language does show Portuguese influence, although most people are not aware of it. They often use fuan, or heart, to mean the locus of emotions. In Tetun, it would traditionally be laran, the inside. They also use heat as a symbol for something that's good. You warm up your emotions. You're warm towards people. Whereas in Tetun, traditionally, heat is a dangerous thing. Similes. Only 33% of the poems had similes, which can last the whole poem, such as a comparison of the young people with seeds. Anthropomorphism is less common than metaphor, but it does occur, as in this poem from Cornelio Amaral, I Would Love to Laugh.
Hey contenti. Tansa. Ola kohi luta ho diharahun triste nebe ukunhau.
The whole poem is addressed to happiness, and he's lamenting that happiness doesn't fight the sadness that rules him. There are other types of poetic language that we haven't found, or that is very rare. One is metonymy, which we did show you in the previous poem, euphemism, and irony and sarcasm. In fact, irony and sarcasm are very rare, or almost non-existent in Tetun. There are other poetic features that we didn't find. Rhythm, fixed number of syllables or stresses per line, we tried very hard. It's not there. Rhyme, but Hugo Fernandez said that the late Clementino dos Reis Amaral did write rhyming poetry, but we haven't managed to find it. Chiasm, ABBA, is quite common in argumentation, but we haven't found it in poetry. And plays on sounds and puns, alliteration are all very rare. We'll turn now to discourse features. Vocatives. 73% of the poems that we analysed were addressed to someone or something, to a younger brother, to people with opposing ideas, to massacre victims, or just general unspecified you. Almost all poets use the informal singular or, very rarely the plural imi or the formal itabol. They use or even to those normally addressed formally, such as Jesus, or heroes, even to those normally addressed using a plural, such as parliamentarians. In this they follow what priests also do in their sermons, using or to make the message personally relevant. Vocatives occur in the same positions as in prose, either initially or after an exclamation or a short command. And they have the same functions as in prose, to draw attention or prior to a request, an advice or apology, never to introduce information. Rhetorical questions. Almost all have an element of lament or criticism, and many bring to mind the opposite of what's questioned. If you say why, it means it shouldn't be the case. The following is an extract from a poem by Xanana Guzmão, written the day after a massacre of people in the church in Nikisa in 1999. At the time, Xanana was still in prison in Jakarta and still functioning as a resistance leader from there. This poem goes on to similarly challenge the sacred powers, the spirit of the dead and the spirit of the land, but we'll start with the challenge to God.
Maromak, povo Timor salsa hodihetan susar bebek nune. Maromak, povo Timor ni sala saida hodihetan mate bebek nune.
There are other functions for rhetorical questions that we haven't noted in poetry, even though they're common in prose, such as introducing a reason, introducing an important character or a problem, or stating assumed background knowledge. We assume that this is because those functions are mainly used for narratives or arguments, and that these don't turn up very often in poetry. Quotes very often occur without quotation marks or any other punctuation. They may omit the quote margin and not even identify who the speaker is. And for initial quote margins, which is the normal, the end of the quote can be hard to identify. The following extract is from a poem by Janio Tillman, recounting a dream that showed the way to him.
Ia tempo mesak, caderno, lapigera haruka mensagem furakida lihusimehi dehan. Calma, calma, calma. Be calm, be calm, be calm.
This is also quite unusual, including English. Most quotes give what in Tetun is called a liamenon, advice, encouragement, and often in the climax of the poem. Some give various people's opinions, especially so that the poet can answer with his or her own opposing views, and a few quote conversations. The main point, or the climax, is almost always in the last line or pair of lines, just as it is in speeches. It's often a message of encouragement, or a statement of what the addressee should do, both, as we noted, classed as liamenon. Here is an example from Abe Barreto, a very short poem which reminds us that the topics dealt with by Timorese poets are not restricted to Timor itself.
Baghdad Kanek Necklace, Baghdad Monotone, Beat Like, Baghdad Larang Baru Haris Horan, Baghdad Nikanek Itahotu Nikanek.
So what makes Tetun Dili poetry? We've concluded poetry is always in lines. The vocabulary potentially has some Tetun influence and relatively little Portuguese. The grammar potentially has some Tetun influence and no Portuguese or Indonesian influence. The poetic devices have more parallelism and figurative language than in prose. But above all, poetry speaks to the heart as well as to the mind. All the poets, when we asked which of their poems they liked best, chose poems based on their content. So, thank you, Tetun Dili poets, in a language many of you didn't speak at home, a language you were not educated in, a language only widely written these last 20 years. A language many say is not yet developed. You're expressing our human conditions in words that speak to the heart, mind and soul. Thank you.